The moment my grandmother's painting sold for $8 million at Sotheby's, my phone exploded with messages. I silenced it, watching from the back of the auction room as art collectors and critics whispered excitedly about the rediscovered masterpiece by Elizabeth Morgan, the once forgotten female artist now experiencing a posthumous renaissance. None of them knew I was her granddaughter, or that the painting had been hanging in my childhood bedroom for 30 years. "Congratulations, Ms. Harmon," the auction house representative said afterward, shaking my hand firmly. "Your grandmother's work has certainly found its rightful place in art history." I nodded, still processing the surreal experience of watching strangers bid millions for the canvas my grandmother had gifted me on my 8th birthday. The canvas my mother had tried to throw away during one of her drunken rages, calling it worthless, just like its creator. "When would you like us to transfer the funds?" the representative asked. "Next week is fine," I replied. "I have some matters to attend to first." Those matters included the family gathering scheduled for tomorrow, the first time in 5 years all of us would be in the same room. My mother had insisted on it, claiming she needed to discuss important family business. Given that she'd barely acknowledged my existence since I left home at 18, I suspected her sudden interest had something to do with the recent articles about Elizabeth Morgan's skyrocketing value in the art world. The next day, I pulled up to my mother's sprawling Victorian home in Westchester, the Morgan family seat for 4 generations. My cousin Rachel's BMW was already parked in the circular driveway alongside my brother Peter's Range Rover. I smoothed down my simple black dress, applying lipstick in the rearview mirror before stepping out. For once, I wanted to look completely put together when facing my family. Inside, Mother presided over the formal living room like a queen, elegantly arranged on her favorite chaise lounge despite being only 68. Her hair was perfectly colored and styled, not a strand out of place. Rachel sat nearby, scrolling through her phone, while Peter stood by the fireplace, drink already in hand by 11 in the morning. "Catherine," my mother acknowledged coolly as I entered, "you finally decided to join us." "Traffic was heavy," I lied, having deliberately timed my arrival to avoid pre-meeting small talk. "Your sister won't be joining us?" Mother asked, though it sounded more like an accusation. "Joanna's still in Tanzania with Doctors Without Borders," I reminded her, "as I mentioned when you called." Mother waved this away as if international humanitarian work was a flimsy excuse for missing family obligations. "Well, we'll have to proceed without her. Franklin will be joining us shortly." Franklin Whitmore had been my mother's lawyer since before I was born. His arrival confirmed my suspicions that this family meeting had financial implications. Rachel finally looked up from her phone, her expression animated for the first time. "Is this about grandmother's paintings?" I saw the Sotheby's auction results. $8 million. She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be thrilled, Catherine. How lucky that you had that painting all these years." "Luck had nothing to do with it," I replied evenly. "Grandmother gave it to me." "Yes, before anyone knew what those paintings would be worth," Peter interjected, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "If she'd known, I doubt she would have handed it to an 8-year-old. I bit back a retort as Franklin entered the room, briefcase in hand. After perfunctory greetings, he settled into an armchair and opened his case. "As you all know," my mother began, "my mother, Elizabeth Morgan, has recently become rather commercially valuable in the art world. This unexpected development has created certain complications regarding family assets." "There are no complications," I said quietly. "Grandmother gave me that painting as a gift. I have the letter she wrote with it." A letter that conveniently appeared just as her work started gaining recognition, Peter muttered. "Catherine," Mother continued as if I hadn't spoken, "we all know my relationship with my mother was strained, but that doesn't change the fact that her work represents our family legacy. Franklin has prepared documents establishing a family trust for all of Elizabeth Morgan's remaining works and the proceeds from their sales." Franklin began distributing folders. The Morgan Family Art Trust would manage all known works by Elizabeth Morgan, with profits distributed equally among all direct descendants. This would include the proceeds from the recent Sotheby's sale. I felt a cold wave of anger wash over me. "So you want me to hand over $8 million to a trust you control, after you spent my entire childhood telling me grandmother was a disgrace to the family, after you tried to throw away her paintings, After you forbade me from even speaking her name in this house? Don't be dramatic, Catherine, Mother sighed. This isn't personal. It's about preserving family assets. Actually, I said, opening my handbag and removing a slim folder of my own. This is very personal, but not in the way you think. I placed the folder on the coffee table. 3 months ago, when the MoMA retrospective of grandmother's work was announced, I hired an investigator. I wanted to locate any of her paintings that might still exist outside museums. What I found instead was much more interesting. The room had gone very quiet. Even Peter had stopped drinking. Elizabeth Morgan didn't just leave paintings, I continued. She left a detailed journal, which has been in the possession of her former gallery owner's family for the past 30 years, along with some very interesting correspondence. What kind of correspondence? Rachel asked, unable to hide her curiosity. I removed several photocopied pages from the folder. Letters that explain why grandmother left so suddenly in 1979. Why she never returned to this house. Why she was erased from our family history. Mother had gone very still, her hands gripping her armrest so tightly her knuckles were white. It seems grandmother discovered that her husband, our grandfather, had been systematically selling her paintings and keeping all the money. When she confronted him, he threatened to have her committed to a psychiatric institution if she tried to leave or take legal action. Back then, it was still disturbingly easy for a husband to do that to his wife. I looked directly at my mother, but what's most interesting is that there was someone who helped him cover it all up. Someone who continued selling grandmother's works secretly even after grandfather died. Someone who knew exactly how valuable those paintings would eventually become. Peter was watching our mother now too, his expression unreadable. Grandmother didn't abandon her family as we were always told, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion building inside me. She was driven away, then systematically erased and discredited, made to sound unstable and selfish when in reality she was the victim. I pulled out one final document, a bank statement. This is a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. It contains just over $30 million from the sale of Elizabeth Morgan paintings over the past 4 decades. Mother has been the sole signatory since grandfather's death in 1992. The silence in the room was deafening. Rachel's mouth had fallen open, while Peter stood frozen by the fireplace. You stole from your own mother, I said to my mother, whose face had become a rigid mask. You helped grandfather push her out, then continued selling her work while telling us she was nothing. You have no idea what you're talking about, Mother finally hissed, but her voice lacked conviction. Actually, I do. Grandmother's journal explains everything in detail. She kept track of every painting, every sale she knew about. And her gallery owner kept records too. Records I now have. As for the ones she didn't know about, I nodded toward the bank statement. The money tells its own story. Franklin shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Diane, if these allegations have merit. They don't, my mother snapped. Catherine has always had an overactive imagination, just like her grandmother. I smiled thinly. The New York Times doesn't think so. They're running an investigative piece next Sunday on the lost years of Elizabeth Morgan, including the family conspiracy that kept her from receiving recognition during her lifetime. I've given them copies of everything. Peter finally spoke, his voice hollow. Is this true, Mother? When she didn't answer, her silence was confirmation enough. There won't be the family trust, I said, standing up. The painting was mine to sell. The 7 remaining paintings in grandmother's studio apartment, which she left specifically to me in her will, the will you told me didn't exist, are also mine. As for grandmother's estate and the proceeds from the sales you conducted illegally over the years, I glanced at Franklin, who looked increasingly distressed. I suggest you consult with a criminal attorney. Art fraud across state lines is a federal offense. You would do this to your own mother? Mother asked, finding her voice at last. I'm not doing anything to you, I replied calmly. I'm simply revealing the truth you've hidden from all of us for decades. As I turned to leave, Rachel called after me. Catherine, wait. What happens now? To the family? I paused at the doorway, considering her question. Rachel and Peter had been shaped by the same toxic family dynamics I had escaped. They hadn't known the truth either. That depends on all of you, I said finally. Grandmother is being honored with a permanent gallery at the Museum of Modern Art next month. I'll be speaking at the opening. You're welcome to attend, to hear about who she really was, not the version of her we were taught to despise. I left them sitting in stunned silence, the weight of decades of family secrets hanging in the air between them. Outside, the spring air felt cleansing against my skin. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free of the Morgan family legacy, not the legacy of paintings and wealth that my mother had coveted, but the legacy of lies and silence that had shaped all our lives. 3 weeks later, I stood at the podium in the Elizabeth Morgan Gallery at MoMA, looking out at the assembled crowd of art critics, collectors, and museum patrons. To my surprise, in the back row sat Peter and Rachel, their expressions solemn but attentive. My mother was notably absent. Last I'd heard, she was consulting with lawyers about the impending investigation. Elizabeth Morgan painted truth as she saw it. I began, gesturing to the vibrant canvases surrounding us. In an era when women were expected to be decorative and agreeable, she created art that was challenging and profound. She paid a heavy price for that authenticity, losing her family, her home, and for many years, her rightful place in the art world. I paused, making eye contact with my siblings at the back of the room. But the truth, once buried, has a way of resurfacing. Like these paintings that spent decades in storage or hanging unrecognized on walls, Elizabeth Morgan's story has finally emerged into the light, and with it comes an opportunity for healing, for reconciliation, and for justice delayed but not denied. After the ceremony, Peter approached me hesitantly, Rachel trailing behind him. "Your speech was beautiful," my sister said softly. "I wish I had known her." "So do I replied. It was the first genuine moment we'd shared in years. Peter cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the truth having a way of resurfacing." He looked uncomfortable but determined. "There are some papers in Father's study, correspondence between him and Mother about Grandmother. Things I found years ago but didn't understand at the time. You should have them." I studied my brother's face, seeing something new there, perhaps the beginning of honesty. "Thank you, Peter." "What will happen to Mother?" Rachel asked, her voice low. "That's up to the authorities now," I said, "and to her, whether she finally tells the truth or continues to deny it." Later that evening, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by my grandmother's paintings, vibrant, challenging works that had finally found the recognition they deserved. On my coffee table lay the journal I'd recovered, filled with Elizabeth Morgan's thoughts, fears, and unwavering commitment to her art despite everything it cost her. On the final page, she'd written words that had become my mantra throughout this ordeal. "The truth is never truly lost. It waits, patient as paint drying on canvas, for someone brave enough to see it." I had seen it. After decades of family secrets and lies, I had finally uncovered the truth about my grandmother, and about myself. I was Elizabeth Morgan's granddaughter, not just in blood, but in spirit, and like her, I had found the courage to stand in my truth, regardless of the cost. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a Westchester area code. "Catherine?" My mother's voice sounded different, smaller somehow, without its usual imperial certainty. "We need to talk." I took a deep breath, looking at my grandmother's self-portrait watching me from across the room, her eyes fierce and knowing, her posture unyielding. "Yes," I said finally, "I think we do." Whether this conversation would bring healing or more pain remained to be seen, but at least it would begin with truth. After a lifetime of silence that felt like a masterpiece in itself,